The first Europeans to set foot in the New World. Part 5. Portugal, France, and the race for the New World. Spain was the first European power to transform exploration into empire in the Americas, but it did not remain alone for long. Other European nations watched Spain's growing wealth with envy and alarm. By the early 16th century, Portugal, France, and later England entered the race for the New World, each pursuing its own interests, strategies, and forms of control. The Atlantic became a battlefield of ambition. Portugal had been exploring long before Columbus. Even before 1492, Portuguese ships had pushed steadily down the coast of Africa, seeking a sea route to Asia. When Columbus returned claiming lands for Spain, Portugal moved quickly to protect its interests. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 divided newly discovered territories between Spain and Portugal, granting Portugal control over lands east of the agreed line. This division would give Portugal Brazil. In 1500, Portuguese navigator Pedro Álvares Cabral was blown westward while sailing toward India. He made landfall on the eastern coast of South America, claiming the territory for Portugal. The land would later be named Brazil. Unlike Spain, Portugal initially showed little interest in large-scale conquest. Early Portuguese activity in Brazil focused on trade rather than settlement. Brazil wood, prized in Europe for its red dye, became the first major export. Portuguese traders established coastal outposts and relied heavily on indigenous labor. This relationship soon turned violent. As demand for labor increased, indigenous populations were enslaved, displaced, or killed. Disease again played a devastating role. When native populations declined, Portugal turned increasingly to African slave labor, laying the foundation for Brazil's future as a plantation-based economy. Sugar transformed Brazil. By the mid-16th century, sugar plantations dominated the Brazilian economy. Enslaved Africans were forced to work under brutal conditions. Brazil would eventually become the largest destination for enslaved Africans in the Atlantic world. While Portugal consolidated Brazil, France pursued a different path. France lacked the early naval dominance of Spain and Portugal, but refused to be excluded from the New World. French explorers focused on North America, particularly the regions of present-day Canada and the Mississippi River Valley. In 1534, Jacques Cartier explored the St. Lawrence River. Cartier claimed the region for France, laying the foundation for New France. Unlike Spanish conquests, French expansion relied more on trade than outright domination. The fur trade became the backbone of French colonial efforts. Furs, especially beaver pelts, were in high demand in Europe. French traders formed alliances with indigenous peoples, exchanging goods for pelts. These relationships were complex and often mutually beneficial, at least initially. French settlers were fewer in number, and survival depended on cooperation rather than conquest. Missionaries followed traders. Jesuit missionaries sought to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity. While some conversions occurred, missionaries often struggled to understand or respect native cultures. Nonetheless, French colonial society developed differently from Spanish colonies, with more cultural exchange and intermarriage. Despite this, conflict was inevitable. French expansion brought competition with indigenous groups and rival European powers. Over time, alliances shifted and violence increased, particularly as English colonists entered the region. England entered the race late, but with determination. For much of the 16th century, England lacked the resources to challenge Spain directly. Instead, English sailors turned to privateering, state-sponsored piracy. Figures such as Sir Francis Drake attacked Spanish ships, disrupting Spain's flow of New World wealth. These raids weakened Spanish dominance. By the late 16th century, England began seeking permanent colonies. The goal was not immediate wealth, but long-term settlement and expansion. Each European power approached the New World differently. Spain pursued conquest and extraction of precious metals. Portugal built plantation economies based on enslaved labor. France focused on trade and alliances. England would emphasize settlement and land ownership. Yet all shared common traits. All relied on indigenous displacement. All benefited from forced labor, whether indigenous or African. All reshaped the Atlantic world through trade, migration, and violence. The race for the New World intensified competition. Rivalries between European powers spilled into colonial conflicts. Alliances with indigenous groups drew native societies into European wars. The Americas became an extension of European politics. By the early 17th century, Spain no longer stood unchallenged. The New World was no longer a Spanish domain alone. It had become a contested space where multiple empires competed for land, labor, and power. In the next part of this series, we will examine how England attempted to establish its first permanent colonies in North America, and why some of those early efforts failed.